Hey everyone, welcome back to Capital Connection. My name's Conan Smith. I am the president and CEO of the Michigan Environmental Council, and so glad to have you back on the show. We're going to talk today about green burials, like what we do at the end of life that is in concert with the planet. And I am thrilled today to be joined by Stephen Jukuri.
Jukuri.
I almost got it, Stephen. I'm so sorry. Help me one more time.
Jukuri.
Jukuri. I was like, oh, come on, man. Stephen Jukuri, who is represents the Keweenaw Green Burial Council and Alliance, excuse me, and they are the newest member organization of the Michigan Environmental Council. So, Stephen, please forgive me as we get to know each other better. I will get better with all of those monikers. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
So, where in the Upper Peninsula are you exactly for folks on the webinar who might not be as familiar with the UP?
Well, you know, Miss Michigan and Mr. UP, we are right here, pretty much right at the top. This is the Keweenaw Peninsula right here.
Very tip, incredibly beautiful country.
Yes.
I spent a fair amount of my youth in the Porcupine Mountains, and then fell in love with Isle Royale. So came through the Keweenaw pretty regularly as a young man. Constantly fell back in love, like every time I came through.
You know, people up here all really love it. And the ones who don't, they leave.
Can you tell us a little bit about just what green burial is and what the Keweenaw Green Burial Alliance is working on? Instead of
Sure. I'll give you a little history to lead into that. It was about 16, 18 years ago that a group of people up here decided that they wanted a conservation cemetery. And they created a corporate structure for that called the 501c13 Cemetery Association. And for about 10 years, they were trying to pull together the capital for that, because it is capital intensive. You need the land. In Michigan, you need a $50,000 endowment before you can start operations. And then you got the whole operations piece. And they had a few starts and stalls. And about 8 years ago, they started to decide that, you know, this is tougher than we thought, but we've got lots of local cemeteries. Let's work with them to see if green burial can get integrated there. Kind of thing that is happening elsewhere in the state. For example, I know the Blue Huron Headwaters Conservancy has been working with an Oakland County cemetery for the last 10 years in a similar capacity. So the focus shifted, and that's about when I joined the organization. And we created a 501c3 instead, a nonprofit group, with a focus on advocating for green burial in our existing cemeteries.
Yeah, that's great.
We're a very lean organization, no budget, 9-member board, and we have one funeral director slot on our board. So we keep very open communications with funeral directors locally. And we have 97 members. That's mostly a show of support. But our whole goal is to raise awareness, public education, which creates demand for green burial. And then we help the cemeteries and the funeral directors serve and meet that demand. We kind of support them. So
what exactly is a green burial? What constitutes a green burial?
Well, it's actually really the simplest form of burial that you can imagine. Take that body and put it in a grave without all the usual things that happen with conventional burial. The big ones there are, with conventional burial, are the vault, which almost every cemetery in the state has been requiring vaults now for a couple of generations. And generally, especially if there's going to be public viewing of the body, there's embalming involved. And then, of course, a lot of materials that are not biodegradable. So green burial looks to remove all those pieces and allow for a natural decomposition of the body. And The gold standard for green burial is a conservation cemetery.
Okay.
And I think there are a couple down in lower Michigan. But that's where you take an area of land and you keep it, maintain it in its natural state, minimal interference. And you, as I like to say, you slip those bodies just below the surface where they will hopefully do a little more good than harm. And really a great combination of, there is a human use for that land, but that human use is not interfering with the natural environment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the gold standard. When we're working with local cemeteries, ones that have been operating for 100 years or more, it's really a matter of how green can we get. And what works well is, of course, they have to eliminate the vault. That's the cemetery rule that kind of is the hinge for all of this. You also need supportive funeral directors, which we have. And we've also learned that you need an aesthetically pleasing site.
Absolutely.
We've had some differential implementations of green burial here, and it has really showed up in terms of the amount that people are attracted to it in plot sales and burials. So a lot of other things come into play. We found that, you take out embalming, and then you have to shorten the time between somebody dies and when they are buried. A lot of conventional funerals up here, like people flying in from all over the country, the embalming, sometimes the funeral is a week after the person died, even with an open casket. Can't do that with green burial. You get a shorter time frame to work with.
Mm-hmm.
It brings up old issues about burial, like will wild animals dig it up, and will the grave collapse and stuff like that. And the biggest one for us is when you take out the vault, you also take out the vault company and their apparatus for lowering things into the hole. So the big question becomes, how do we get the body in that hole?
Uh-huh.
And that's, I think it was Wendell Berry who said, there's no cultural learning without cultural forgetting. For the last couple of generations, people have been relying on all this equipment and stuff to get bodies in the ground. Nobody remembered how in the world you get a body in the ground without all of this apparatus.
I'm going to put up a couple photos that you shared about that process. Can you then describe it to our team?
Yes. This is perfect connection here. When I got involved with the group about, I think it was 6-7 years ago, the board had already decided in a very prescient way that we need to reconnect with all the processes with green burial. And so they brought up Mary Lynn Rush, who's in the green raincoat there on the right with the green hat. And she did a presentation publicly on home funerals. She does home funerals in the Ann Arbor area without embalming, etc. And the next day we did a practicum. Okay, how do you actually do the burial part? And she walked us through that. So what you're seeing here is not an actual burial, it's from our practicum.
Mm-hmm.
Looks the same as an actual burial though. Green burials tend to be far less formal, not in your high heels and ties and stuff like that. Several of them, and the word has gone out, bring your shovel because we're going to fill in the grave ourselves.
Sure.
But we learned the skills that are involved with actually handling a burial into a grave. And these skills ended up being really important because when the first couple of green burials happened in the Chastel Cemetery, really the funeral directors, they were prepared for it, and yet they weren't prepared. You know how that goes if you haven't done it before?
Right, absolutely.
And so the funeral director relied on us to come in and to be the pallbearers for that burial and to do the lowering. Now, after a couple of those were done, now the funeral directors are kind of like back in tune with how this part of the process goes. And it was also a question of whose responsibility is it? Because the cemetery is like, well, we don't put bodies into the grave. Somebody else does that.
The vault company normally does that, right? Yeah.
Yes. So at this point, it's the funeral director's responsibility, but they have ramped up. They have a decent sense of how to go about it.
That's pretty amazing. Like to think about the intense personal connection to the process that a green burial encompasses. Then, like, it's got to feel. I imagine you've attended a number of these, and it's just got to feel right to be a part of that moment.
It is a whole different feel. I have a big family up here because my great grandparents came here, turn of the 19th century there, and I go to a lot of funerals every year. The conventional ones, to me, they feel sterile and they feel mechanical. The green burials have been, I want to say, pleasurable in a lot of ways. The pallbearers have a real job, not just a symbolic job. For some of them, everybody hangs out, they fill in the grave. It takes an hour or two. We talk, we socialize, we remember the person. It feels natural. And really, I'm seeing the term green burial shift to natural burial for a lot of good reasons.
Mhm.
But it feels like a very natural process. My father didn't have a green burial because he died shortly before I moved back up here. And yet the one thing I was able to finagle was that we could fill in the grave ourselves. And so my family went out there, we had a picnic in the cemetery, we hung out for the morning, took our time, we explored, looked at the 100-year-old tombstones, etc. Whole different kind of feel to it.
I want to share with folks too. We're mourning the loss, celebrating the life of a longtime friend of the environment who passed away earlier this month, excuse me. His name is Ken Dahlberg. Dr. Dahlberg was a professor at Western Michigan University, and he was in the political science department, and he directed the environmental studies program there. He himself had a green burial, and the way that he described it, Stephen, was he wanted to make sure that he was giving back to the earth that had given so much to him as well. So I imagine for the person who's envisioning their passing and choosing green burial as an option, that closing of the circle is an important spiritual aspect of the work.
Yeah, for me, it's interesting that you mentioned spiritual. What we're finding is that people connect to green burial from a number of different directions. My entry point was what I call a romantic connection, which is that I love my home up here. I love this place.
Mm-hmm.
I did move away for 20 years, lived in Benton Harbor, Michigan, working down there. And my main goal coming back was to make sure that green burial was possible because I wanted to reintegrate with the land up here. I wanted to believe that if I'm going to be reincarnated, I'm being reincarnated as the trees,
Right.
birds, worms, you name it. But also green burial is attractive for religious reasons. Muslim and Jewish religions, their precept is essentially green burial.
Right. Of course.
We have a small Russian Orthodox community up here. Their choice is essentially green burial. And I'm noticing even some movement among mainline Christians who feel like the biblical intent is essentially the same as green burial. We have a lot of outdoors people. They might be carrying their NRA card and driving around on four-wheelers, etc., but they love being in the woods. They like green burial because when they walk through a well-designed green burial site, it feels like you're walking through the woods.
Yeah.
So,
When we have this long tradition, American tradition of vault burials, and when you're talking to people about green burial, I remember this is probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I worked with this fellow named Joe Seehey, who started the U.S. Green Burial Alliance, and it seemed like a radical concept, to get the government behind the policies that needed to be adapted and to engage the funeral directors. Have you seen that change? Is there still a hesitancy from people to consider green burial, or is it more mainstream, and do people respond to it well when you raise it as an option now?
I would say that in the last 8 years, we have seen a pretty big change in terms of people respond to it as a viable option. The hesitancy, well, essentially, cemeteries want vaults because they don't want graves to collapse. And that's because they used to use wooden vaults. And so you had a lot of dead air space in those burials. You had a casket inside a wooden vault, eventually it would rot and collapse. So
Sure.
one of the precepts we talk with cemeteries about is you can put in guidelines to minimize the empty airspace there. You will not have grave collapses. And if you design it in a place where you're going to leave it natural, you don't need to worry about running your lawnmowers over it. Frankly, another reason people connect is expense, because green burials are burials that are a lot cheaper than conventional ones. You don't have to buy the vaults. You don't feel the need to buy an expensive casket. You don't do the embalming. And our local funeral directors are pricing green burial close to cremation. Often the only difference in the cost is buying the plot.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's essentially the same. So it appeals from a financial perspective, and our local cemeteries are getting killed financially on cemetery maintenance. The legacy costs of manicured cemeteries is far beyond what they pull in as revenue.
Of course. Oh, that
So
makes total sense.
in the long run, allowing a site to stay in its natural state is a huge cost savings. It doesn't create a legacy cost.
I'm gonna share a photo that you shared with us here. Like this is a site, right? So there are a lot of questions in the chat and in the Q&A, Stephen, about what a space might actually look like, and can you adorn it? Can you put a headstone as a memorial? How do people handle that aspect of it?
Well, it's of course all over the map because we're working with different cemeteries with different priorities. But this shot comes from really our gold standard township cemetery, which is Chassell Township. And the fellow in the middle there with the beard, Joe Youngman, he's a public works guy at Chassell. And when Chassell investigated this, he said, I think I've got a spot for it in the cemetery. He contacted us, and then we worked for quite a while, coming to like a meeting of the minds, like here's what cemeteries need to operate, here's what green burial people want, and landed on a beautiful site here. It feels like you're walking through the woods. Joe says that his plots per acre ratio is extremely bad for a cemetery because he puts little blocks of graves in between the church trees.
Mm-hmm.
And they are trying to allow winter burial. First cemetery here in the Keweenaw Peninsula to do that for, again, several generations. They don't get a lot of snow in Chassell. We call it the banana belt. And they allow stone markers, but they have to be flush with the ground. And they're very clear that they don't maintain the area in any special way. They do expect all natural burial materials. Most of the burials there so far have been either cardboard box or simply a shroud. And there's been, I think there's at least 6 burials, and they sold out this area pretty quickly. That was 40 some plots. And then Joe developed some other areas in another part of the cemetery that have a similar feel, not as beautiful as this one. So their plot sales are probably around 60 or so. And we've learned the hard way that the aesthetics matter. People want to envision what this photograph is showing. And when they walk through an area, that's what they want. We have another cemetery that just designated a part of their conventional burial area for green burial. And that's right outside of Houghton. People look at the two and they go, Chassell, that's
Sure.
where I want to go. That's the beautiful one. So in the last 5 years, Chassel has sold 60 some plots, and the other one has sold none.
Wow, that's interesting. It, it makes total sense. And I'm surprised a little bit at the same time that folks who appreciate traditional cemetery, who have that like cultural experience, wouldn't want to do a green burial in a traditional cemetery.
Um, yeah, it's, I think the marketplace is still sorting out.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, it's new enough that people gotta you got your early adopters, and your early adopters probably want to be in the woods.
Yes, and we really, part of the problem with the cemetery that's not done well, and I will add the cemetery in Marquette, is that when we've presented, we focused on the get rid of the vault, get rid of the embalming, have all natural materials, and we neglected to say, and make sure it's aesthetically pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
So the city of Marquette Cemetery did put in a green burial spot after our presentation, and unfortunately it's ugly. And I think in 4 years now, they may have sold one or two graves there, but it has no appeal. All it does is meet the minimum standards for green burial. It doesn't provide anything attractive for people. But we get a lot of our interest. This is the marketplace sorting itself out, is a lot of people still are not aware of green burial as an option. Don't know what it is, don't understand it. So we try to get in the local newspaper, the local media a couple times a year. We raise the awareness, and then people come to us and say, can I have green burial in my cemetery? And we say, well, probably not to our knowledge. Can you make it happen? And we say, well, we really can't, but you probably can. If you go to whoever runs your cemetery and you say, I'd like this, and then we say, and offer our help. Mm-hmm. And so when the township or other cemetery operator comes to us for help to do that, then we're in a good position to work with them over time. Townships, their operations fluctuate like crazy. So for example, we started that process last summer with a tiny cemetery in the southern part of the county. Did a site visit, talked about it, and then we haven't heard anything since. We try not to push, but I'll probably send out a little email in the next month and say, hey, it's summer again. Are you still thinking about this? We're here if you need us, and work with them on that.
We are really fortunate to be joined today in the audience by PJ Petiprin, who works for Representative Will Snyder from the Muskegon area. Rep. Snyder is preparing legislation to make green burial an easier and more consistent part of the end of life process. Stephen, as you're thinking through your experiences, are there local policies, state government reforms, or practices for the funerary industry that you think should be highly prioritized to make this more common and easier to access?
There's probably a couple of things that would make it easier. The irony is that nothing in Michigan prevents green burial except for a vault requirement by a specific cemetery.
Okay.
The state does not require vaults, but it allows cemeteries to require them. That's the only real thing that's blocking it. But there are things that make it more difficult. And let me mention that we sure would not like to see here what's happening in Minnesota right now, because there's been a backlash against the attempt to put in a conservation cemetery, and now there's a Senate bill that is establishing an 18-month moratorium on green burial until it can be thoroughly researched and regulated, et cetera. But one of the biggest roadblocks right now for people with green burial is that there is confusion about how much time a funeral director can extend an unembalmed body's existence before going into cremation or burial. And other states, funeral directors can use refrigeration to do that. They can use other techniques. Here, it's very confusing what the deal really is. And funeral directors are professionals. They should, in our opinion, be allowed to use their professional judgment on how long they can maintain a body in a safe, in terms of public health and respect for the body kind of way before burial, and have a little flexibility. And the reality is that when somebody dies on a Thursday night, they're not in the crematory on the weekends, or at least up here, crematories don't work on the weekends. It goes beyond the roughly 2-day time period that is the safe harbor for funeral directors. So clarity on that. I think it's not good that conservation cemeteries have to have a $50,000 endowment, because the endowment is mostly for maintenance, to make sure the cemetery can be maintained. Conservation cemeteries don't have legacy maintenance costs.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So that kind of thing, and maybe a couple other things that would bear on it. Maybe it would be good to define green burial officially. Up here in the UP, we just do the things that we think are right. We don't need them defined for us too carefully. And we don't want to we don't want to have to not say green burial if it doesn't meet a bunch of criteria, because up here, the gold standard is a conservation cemetery, but we're pretty happy with silver and bronze. In the next 100 years, we're going to have 8 to 10 billion deaths on this globe. And we need our current cemeteries to offer this option so we can transition to a more ecologically sound approach to disposition of the human body.
I love that reminder that this is an ecological cycle challenge for the planet that is long term, that we can't just not allow nature to have its course with our bodies as well.
Yes. Human culture has a hard time with that. The animal way of death, according to, I think, Barrett Heinrich, is that the body of the animal is consumed by predators and scavengers, all the way from animals to birds to insects, microorganisms. We don't allow that to happen easily with the human body. We're not going to allow, burial by predator and scavenger, but we have an option that provides reintegration. Human composting looks promising. We're agnostic on it right now because we don't know enough. Not legal in Michigan right now, but it may be a good option. We're still kind of looking into that as well.
We're getting close to the end here. Stephen, we're so excited at MEC to have you as a member organization. Can you tell folks what they can do to learn more about green burial, how they might get involved with your organization, and if they're in the area, are there opportunities to volunteer? And if they're not, where would you recommend that they go to get involved?
Well, we're up in this far corner of the UP. So the main source of information we can provide is our website. We'll do Zoom consults outside of our local area in the UP, but we have limits because there's just 9 people on the board, and it's pretty much a board-driven effort. Most of our effort is put on working with individual cemeteries. But if you're in Lower Michigan, there are cemeteries there that are interested. The best thing you can do is use your power as a consumer. I don't care how old you are. Figure out what you want done with your body. If it's green burial, go and talk to some funeral directors in your area. Make your needs known. Plan your funeral. See if your preferred cemetery offers it. If not, ask for it. Be prepared to buy a plot if they provide it, and be prepared to connect them with some resources. Probably that Blue Huron Headwaters Conservancy is a good resource down there because they've been working on this. There may be others in Lower Michigan, but it's a demand-driven phenomenon. When we first tried to talk to cemeteries, they would say, well, nobody wants this. So we realized we had to actually tell people the option exists, and then they go and they ask for it. And funeral directors respond.
Sure.
And the funeral industry is on top of green burial. It's a topic of conversation among the funeral director networks and conferences and all of that. Cemeteries, that's a one-by-one knock them off one by one kind of process.
I love that. Well, folks, like if you're interested in this, make sure you use your consumer power to make your interest known to the local cemeteries and the industry itself. You can lean on the Environmental Council when it comes to advocacy in the state capitol around these policies, and we in turn lean on you, Stephen, to make sure that we're advocating for the right thing in the right place at the right time. Thank you. We're at the hour. I really appreciate you taking time with us. It's been really great to chat.
It has. Great to meet you too. Thank you, everybody.
So folks, if you're new to the webinar, we will follow up with you. If you registered for the webinar, there are a bunch of questions in the chat. There are a bunch of questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to touch on today, but you can expect an email follow-up from Bo Brockett on our staff. He'll work with Stephen and others to make sure that your questions are answered appropriately, and you'll get a copy of this webinar, a link to a copy of the webinar as well. So thanks for your attention and interest. Stephen, great to work with you. Everyone, we'll see you next time on Capital Connection. Take care and have a lovely, wonderful weekend.
You too.
So long.